I want you to picture this. It is 7 in the morning. The temperature outside is sitting at a brutal 11 degrees Fahrenheit. I have frost on the inside of my bedroom window because the seal cracked back in October, and I kept telling myself I would fix it. My coffee maker is gurgling like it is fighting for its life, and I am standing on my front porch in my bathrobe, holding a certified letter from the Maplewood Glen Homeowners Association informing me that I owe $250 in fines. Not because of anything I did. Not because of my lawn, my fence, my paint color, my trash cans being visible from the street, or any one of the 17 other things Sandra Fairbanks had hassled me about since I moved into this neighborhood 4 years ago. No, I owed $250 because my neighbor Dave Kowalski, 3 houses down on the left, had allegedly shoveled his driveway in a manner that the HOA deemed uneven. I want to let that sink in for a second. Uneven snow removal. On someone else's driveway, and somehow the fine landed on me, and not just me. I started looking around that morning as my neighbors began wandering out to their mailboxes in various states of confusion and outrage, and I could see the certified letter envelopes in almost every single hand. Tom and Patrice Nguyen across the street, old Gerald Fletcher 2 doors down, the Acaffer family at the corner, the Mendozas. Even poor Mrs. Abernathy, who was 81 years old, legally blind in one eye, and had literally hired a professional snow removal service to handle her entire property. Every single house on our block had received the same fine letter, all because of Dave Kowalski's driveway. Now let me give you some background on Sandra Fairbanks, because if you are going to understand this story properly, you need to understand her. Sandra moved into Maplewood Glen about 6 years ago, and within 8 months she had gotten herself elected to the HOA board. Within 18 months she was the HOA vice president. And within 3 years she had essentially strong-armed the sitting president, a mild-mannered retired pharmacist named Howard Bilt, into stepping down by flooding the board with procedural complaints about every decision he made, until he finally told her the position was hers, and he was done. Howard now tends to his vegetable garden and refuses to attend HOA meetings, which is the most reasonable response to Sandra Fairbanks that I have ever witnessed. Sandra is the kind of woman who sends certified letters about wind chimes. She has a specific paragraph in the community guidelines, one she personally drafted and pushed through the board, about the acceptable volume range of decorative outdoor accessories. Wind chimes, apparently, must not produce audible sound above a certain decibel level as measured from the property line. She brought a decibel meter to Tom Nguyen's house once. Tom had a set of small bamboo chimes his mother had given him as a housewarming gift. Sandra stood at the edge of his lawn with that meter held out like she was performing some kind of scientific measurement, and when the chimes rang at a gust of wind, she wrote down the number, nodded, and told Tom he had 10 days to bring the chimes into compliance or face a fine. Tom took the chimes inside. He was polite about it, but I saw his face. And now here we were, middle of January. The biggest snowstorm the region had seen in 7 years, having dumped 14 inches on Maplewood Glen over the course of 2 days, temperatures refusing to climb above the mid-20s all week, and Sandra had apparently walked the entire block with a clipboard and measured, or claimed to measure, the evenness of everyone's snow removal efforts, and decided that Dave Kowalski's driveway had one section where the snow was cleared to a depth inconsistent with the community standard. The community standard for snow removal, which, as far as any of us knew, had never been a thing before in the history of Maplewood Glen. I read the letter 3 times standing on my porch, my bathrobe flapping in the wind, my breath coming out in thick white clouds. The letter cited Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph B of the Maplewood Glen Community Standards and Regulations, which apparently covered exterior property maintenance during winter months. And then there was a line that I had to read 4 times before I believed it said what it said. as the maintenance condition of one property on Elmhurst Drive directly reflects upon and diminishes the collective aesthetic and safety standards of the surrounding properties. All neighboring homeowners within the defined block boundary are subject to shared accountability fines at the discretion of the HOA board. Shared accountability. I stood there for a moment. I was cold. I was tired. My coffee was not done yet. And I was being fined $250 for shared accountability over Dave Kowalski's uneven driveway. I went back inside, poured my coffee, and started making phone calls. Dave was the first one I called, and bless the man, he answered immediately even though it was barely 7:15, and he worked nights at the distribution center. He sounded exhausted but completely baffled. He told me he had gone out and shoveled his driveway himself during the storm, had done 2 full passes, and had even put down ice melt afterward because his wife Kim had slipped on the porch steps the previous winter and he was paranoid about ice. He said the only reason one section might look uneven was because the plow truck from the city had come down the street and pushed a fresh load of packed snow back up against the end of his driveway after he had already cleared it, and he had not had time to go back out and redo that section before Sandra apparently came marching through with her clipboard. I told him about the letters. He went quiet for a second. Then he said something under his breath that I will not repeat here and told me he would be over by noon. By 9 in the morning, my doorbell had rung 6 times. Tom Nguyen was there. Gerald Fletcher was there. Patris Acaffer, who worked as a paralegal downtown, showed up with her letter, a legal pad, and a thermos of tea, and told me she had already started looking up the HOA's legal authority to issue collective fines. Her husband Marcus brought a plate of his famous banana bread because he said difficult conversations were better with food, and I was not going to argue with that. Mrs. Abernathy could not make it over herself in the cold, but she sent her grandson Terence with her letter and a note that said, and I am quoting directly from her handwriting here, "I pay these people $42 a month, and they have the nerve to fine me for someone else's snow. Tell that Fairbanks woman I said she can take this fine and put it somewhere warm." I taped that note to my refrigerator. We sat around my kitchen table, which was not really big enough for 7 people, but we made it work with the dining chairs pulled over and Marcus's banana bread in the center like the most absurd war council buffet in history, and Patris laid out what she had found. The HOA governing documents for Maplewood Glen, she explained, were based on a standard boilerplate document that had been customized over the years as amendments were passed. Section 12, subsection 4 was real, but Patris had read the full original language and it covered individual property maintenance failures, not collective fines. The shared accountability clause that Sandra had cited in the letter was not in the original document or any amendment that had been properly voted on by the full membership. Tom looked up from his letter. So she just made it up. Patris tapped her legal pad. I need to pull the full amendment log to be sure, but based on what I'm reading, yes. That language does not appear to have been properly adopted. An amendment like that would require a membership vote, not just a board decision. Gerald Fletcher, who was 73 and had a hearing aid that whistled sometimes when he was excited, leaned forward. Can she do that? Just write in whatever she wants. She should not be able to, Patris said. The board can clarify existing rules, but they cannot unilaterally add enforceable fine structures without member approval. If this clause was never properly voted on, these fines are not legally valid. The room got very quiet except for Gerald's hearing aid, which chose that moment to emit a small but triumphant whistle. So what do we do? Dave asked. He had arrived by then, still looking tired from his night shift, wearing a heavy flannel jacket and boots caked with the salt he had apparently been putting down on his driveway before coming over. We request the full governing documents, Patris said. All of them. The original, every amendment, and the meeting minutes that document how each amendment was voted on and approved. We have a right to those as members. and then we compare what she cited to what is actually in there. "She will stonewall us," Tom said. "She always stonewalls." "She can try," Patris said, and there was something in her voice that made me very glad Patris was on our side of this table. "Here is the thing about Maplewood Glen that you should know. It is a nice neighborhood. It is not a fancy neighborhood. We are talking about a collection of houses built in the late 80s and early 90s, mostly 3-bedroom, 2-bath colonials and ranches, reasonable yards, decent trees. The kind of neighborhood where people generally leave each other alone, wave from their driveways, and help each other out when there is a bad storm or someone is moving." Before Sandra Fairbanks ascended to the presidency of the HOA, the association mostly existed to organize the July 4th block party and make sure the common area near the entrance got its grass cut. Nobody was writing violation letters about decibel levels on bamboo wind chimes. The HOA dues were $42 a month per household, which over the years had piled up into a reserve fund that, according to the last financial statement Sandra had distributed, sat at just under $60,000. Nobody had ever quite figured out what that money was being saved for, and any time someone asked at the annual meeting, Sandra would say it was for future capital improvements and long-term infrastructure, and then move on to the next agenda item before anyone could follow up. That was a detail Patris had been quietly curious about for a while. After our kitchen meeting broke up, everyone went home to deal with their own days, and I drafted a formal written request to the HOA board for a complete copy of all governing documents, all amendments, all meeting minutes for the past 3 years, and the current financial records. Patris helped me word it so that it was a proper formal request under the terms of our HOA membership agreement, which required the board to respond within a certain number of days. I sent it certified mail to the HOA's registered address, which happened to be Sandra's house, because of course it was. Then I did something else. I went out to my garage and pulled up the footage from my security camera system. I had installed 4 cameras about 2 years ago after someone had sideswiped my car in the driveway overnight and driven off without leaving a note. The cameras covered my driveway, my front yard, and most of the street in front of my house. I had a month's worth of stored footage, and I went looking for the day Sandra had apparently done her inspection walk. She was not hard to find. There she was, the morning after the second day of the storm, bundled up in her long, puffy coat and her knit hat with the pompon on top, holding her clipboard and walking the block. I watched her stop at each house, write something down and move on. When she got to Dave's driveway, she stopped, looked at the section near the street where the plow had pushed snow back and wrote something on her clipboard. Then she walked a little further down, stopped, looked back at Dave's driveway and wrote something else. And then she walked to every other house on the block and wrote something down at each one. She did not stop to look at anyone's driveways particularly closely at those houses. She just wrote. I clipped that footage and saved it to a separate drive. Now here is where things started escalating, because Sandra, to absolutely no one's surprise, did not take kindly to receiving my certified letter requesting the governing documents. I know this because 2 days after I sent it, I looked out my front window and saw her standing at the end of my driveway in her puffy coat with her clipboard, and then I watched her take a photograph of my house. I went outside. Morning, Sandra. She did not look up immediately from her clipboard. When she did, she had her board president expression on, which was a very specific look she had perfected that combined polite condescension with barely concealed irritation. Larry. I was just doing a routine inspection. You do those a lot lately. What are you finding? Your porch railing appears to need painting. I will have a notice drafted. I looked at my porch railing. There was a very small spot near the bottom where the paint had chipped, which I had been meaning to address before winter came but had not gotten to. It was the size of a quarter. I got your letter about the fine, I said. Yes, I imagine you did. You'll be getting my letter about the governing documents. Something shifted in her expression, just briefly. The board will respond in the appropriate time frame. Great. I also wanted to mention, I said, keeping my voice completely casual, that I've got some really nice camera footage of you doing your inspection the other morning. The day you wrote everyone up. Good resolution, too. You can see the clipboard really clearly. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. I hope the weather treats you well, Sandra. I went back inside. The next week and a half was an interesting kind of Cold War, pun fully intended. Temperatures outside stayed miserable. We had another inch of snow on Wednesday, freezing rain on Friday, and the roads in the neighborhood were an absolute nightmare because the city's budget for salt and plowing had apparently run out mid-season. People were sliding through the stop sign at the corner. Old Gerald Fletcher's car got stuck in his own driveway on Thursday, and I spent 20 minutes helping him push it back up, while we both nearly wiped out on the ice. The community's gas service had a pressure issue for about 3 days because the extreme cold was affecting the line pressure in the distribution system, which meant everyone's furnaces were running low, and the gas company was asking people to turn down their thermostats, which is an absolutely delightful thing to be told when it is 12 degrees outside. Sandra's deadline to respond to my document request came and went. No response. Patris was not surprised. She had anticipated this. She sent her own follow-up letter, this time citing the specific provision of our state's homeowner association statutes that required the board to provide access to governing documents and financial records within a specified window. She noted that failure to comply could constitute a violation of state law and could expose board members to personal liability. That one got a response. 3 days later, I received a large envelope in the mail containing a stack of photocopied documents. I brought them straight to Patris, and she spread them out on her kitchen table and went through them page by page with a highlighter and a cup of tea while Marcus and I sat across from her and watched her face for information. About 40 minutes in, she put down the highlighter and looked up. "It's not there," she said. "The shared accountability clause. There is no amendment in these records that added it. There's a version of Section 12 that talks about individual maintenance obligations, but the collective fine language, the shared accountability piece she cited in our letters, it's not in any properly adopted amendment. And I checked the meeting minutes they gave us. There was never a member vote on it." Marcus reached over and patted the stack of papers. "So she just wrote it in. Looks like it. Someone inserted that language into what appears to be an internal working document that was never formally adopted, but she's been citing it and enforcing it as if it were legitimate." I thought about that for a second. How many other fines has she issued under rules that were never properly adopted? Patris picked up her highlighter again. "That," she said, "is exactly what I'm going to find out next." Over the following week, Patris went through the fine records that had been issued over the past 3 years, which were part of the financial documents we had requested. She cross-referenced every single fine against the governing documents, checking whether each violation cited corresponded to a properly adopted rule. She worked at her kitchen table every evening after work, legal pad filling up with her small, precise handwriting, and she would text me updates periodically. The first text said, "Wind chime decibel rule, not in the approved documents." The second text said, "Holiday decoration removal deadline extended from January 15 to December 31, not in the approved documents." Tom Nguyen was fined for this last year. The third text said, "Driveway material requirement gravel not permitted. Was this ever voted on? Not in what they sent us." By the end of the week, Patris had identified 11 separate fine provisions that appeared to have been inserted into working documents or referenced in fine letters without corresponding to any properly voted and adopted amendment. The total amount fined under these provisions over 3 years, looking just at the records they had provided, came to just over $14,000. I sat with that number for a while. $14,000 in fines issued under rules that had never been properly adopted by the membership. I called Tom Nguyen, Remember when Sandra fined you for the holiday lights being up past December 31st? $200, he said immediately. I was furious. I paid it to avoid the hassle, but I was furious. That rule was never legally adopted. Sandra made it up. The line was quiet for a second. Then Tom said, Larry, I want to be very clear that I want my $200 back. I think you might be able to get it, I said. We scheduled a block meeting for Saturday afternoon, held at my house because I had the most space, and because Marcus had offered to bring more banana bread, which had somehow become the official food of our resistance movement. Almost every household from the block showed up. It was the kind of gathering Maplewood Glen had not seen in years. People packed into my living room and dining room, sitting on windowsills, standing in the kitchen doorway, some folks dragging chairs in from the garage. Outside the windows it was snowing again, a gray January afternoon with wind rattling the glass, and inside there were maybe 25 people all listening to Patris walk through what she had found. She was good at explaining it. She had worked as a paralegal for 12 years, and she had that ability to make complicated things clear without making people feel stupid. She laid out what the governing documents actually said, what Sandra had been citing, the difference between a properly adopted rule and a made-up one, and what the implications were. When she was done, the room was loud for a few minutes. Gerald's hearing aid went off twice. Mrs. Abernathy's grandson Terence, who had relayed everything back to her and had come back with a second note from her that just said, I knew IT, was nodding vigorously. Then a woman named Renata Vasquez from the house at the far end of the block raised her hand and said, She fined me $400 3 years ago for my fence being painted the wrong shade of brown. She had a color chart. Is that real? Patris checked her notes. I need to look at the specific fence provision, but based on what I've seen of how she's been operating, I would not be surprised. $400, Renata said. I refinanced the fence. That got a sound from the room that was somewhere between a groan and a laugh. Then Dave Kowalski, whose driveway had started all of this, said something that crystallized where things needed to go. What are we actually going to do about this? Patris set down her legal pad. A few things. First, we formally dispute all the fines issued under the unverified rules, in writing, citing the governing documents and the lack of proper adoption. Every single one. That puts the HOA in a position where they either have to justify those fines with legitimate authority or withdraw them. And if they stonewall again, someone asked, then we file a complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board. Our state has one. They investigate exactly this kind of thing, and we pursue the improper fines through small claims court if necessary, which individual members can do for amounts under the filing threshold. And the money, Tom said. The reserve fund. That's the part I want to look at more closely, Patris said. The financial records they gave us show the reserve fund at around $60,000. But the breakdown of where that money came from over the past 3 years includes a significant portion from fines. If the fines were issued under illegitimate rules, the question of what happened to that money becomes more serious. She paused. If Sandra has been personally benefiting from those funds in any way, or if she's been misappropriating them, that's not a civil matter. That's potentially criminal. The room got very quiet. I said, how would we know? We'd need to see more detailed financial records than what she gave us. The reserve fund withdrawals, the vendor payments, who was paid for what. She's required to provide those too, and what she sent us was incomplete. We make a new request, more specific, and if she refuses or the records show irregularities, we go from the HOA Oversight Board to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. She said it very calmly, the way you say something when you have been thinking about it for a while and have decided it is correct. You've been working on this for a while, I said to her. Marcus's banana bread is very motivating, she said, and the tension in the room cracked just enough for people to laugh. We sent the formal dispute letters that week, all of us, coordinated through Patris, each one citing the specific fine, the specific provision it had been issued under, and the fact that the provision did not appear in any properly adopted amendment. We sent them certified mail. All 22 households on the block. Sandra's response came 12 days later, a letter on HOA letterhead addressed to all Elmhurst Drive residents, and the tone of it was something to behold. She acknowledged receiving the dispute letters, informed us that the HOA board had reviewed the concerns raised and found them without merit, stated that all fines remained valid and enforceable, and noted that continued failure to pay would result in additional late fees and potential liens on our properties. She also, and this was a new development, fined me personally an additional $150 for correspondence harassment, which she defined as the submission of multiple letters intended to obstruct or burden the board in the performance of its duties. I read that one twice too. Correspondence harassment. I had sent one letter. Patris sent the oversight board complaint the next day. She had already drafted it. She had been ready for exactly this response. The complaint laid out every irregularity she had found, included copies of the disputed fine letters, copies of the governing documents showing the absence of the cited provisions, and a request for a formal investigation into the HOA's fine practices and financial management. She also sent a second, more detailed document request to Sandra, this time specifically listing every category of financial record she wanted, formatted as a statutory request under the state's HOA Transparency Act, and including the specific legal citation that required compliance. Then things got very interesting, because about a week after Patris filed the oversight complaint, she got a call from an investigator at the state's HOA Oversight Office. The investigator told her that the complaint had triggered a preliminary review, and that they had, in fact, already had a separate prior complaint about Maplewood Glen's HOA filed by a previous resident who had sold their home 2 years ago. That prior complaint had been sitting in a pending file, not enough to act on alone, but Patris's detailed submission was enough to open a full investigation. The investigator asked if Patris could provide additional documentation, specifically anything related to the financial records, the amendment history, and evidence of the fine enforcement patterns. Patris said yes, absolutely, and would video footage of the HOA president conducting an inspection walk be useful. The investigator said that would be very useful indeed. I pulled my camera footage and backed up every relevant clip on 2 separate drives, one for Patris and one that I kept at my brother-in-law's house off-site, because I had no idea what Sandra might try to do if she found out an investigation was underway. February arrived, still cold, still miserable, the kind of February where you stop believing winter will ever actually end. The gas pressure issues on our street had mostly resolved, but the roads were still terrible, and the plow truck had taken out someone's mailbox on the next street over. Gerald Fletcher's furnace had started making a noise he described as similar to a cat being sat on, and I spent an afternoon helping him figure out that the igniter was failing and needed to be replaced before it went out entirely, which in that kind of cold would have been a genuine problem for an elderly man living alone. That was the kind of neighborhood we were, the kind of neighborhood that actually existed under all the HOA nonsense. People who helped each other out, people who knew each other's names, people who noticed when something was wrong and did something about it. Sandra, meanwhile, had apparently become aware that something official was in motion because her behavior changed in a way I would describe as cornered. She started doing inspection walks every other day, citing violations left and right, letters going out for things like improperly stored garbage containers and a slightly leaning mailbox post, and someone's holiday wreath that was still up on their door in February. She fined the Mendozas for having a basketball hoop visible from the street, even though that basketball hoop had been there for 5 years and had never once been cited before. The more she issued fines, the worse her position was getting, because every new fine went through Patris, who checked it against the governing documents, and most of them were based on the same pattern of unadopted provisions. Each one became another piece of evidence for the investigation. Tom Nguyen finally snapped, just a little, in a very satisfying way. He went and dug his bamboo wind chimes out of storage, hung them back on his porch, and sent Sandra a written notice informing her that the wind chime decibel rule had never been properly adopted and was therefore unenforceable, and that if the HOA attempted to fine him for the wind chimes, he would be filing his own individual complaint with the Oversight Board and pursuing recovery of his previous fine in small claims court. Sandra sent him a violation notice anyway. Tom filed in small claims court the next day. The date was set for late March, and while Tom prepared his case with Patris's help, the oversight investigation was progressing. The investigator had contacted the HOA board directly, and I know this because the HOA board at this point consisted of Sandra, a man named Phil Greer who mostly showed up to meetings and voted with whatever Sandra said, and a woman named Deirdre Calloway who had been on the board for 2 years and had, according to Patris's read of the meeting minutes, become progressively less enthusiastic about Sandra's methods. Deirdre, it turned out, was who the oversight investigator had spoken to most extensively, and Deirdre, it further turned out, had been uncomfortable for a while. I did not find this out directly. I found it out because Deirdre showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening in mid-February, standing on my porch in a heavy coat with snow in her hair, and asked if she could come in. I made her coffee. She sat at my kitchen table, wrapped her hands around the mug, and said, "I need to tell you some things." Deirdre had been on the board when Sandra had started pushing through the fine structure changes. She had asked questions at the time and been told by Sandra that the modifications were clarifications of existing rules, not new rules, and therefore did not require a member vote. She had not known enough about HOA law at the time to push back. She had voted in favor of what Sandra presented as administrative updates. She had not realized that Sandra was fundamentally changing the fine structure without proper authorization. "When did you realize something was wrong?" I asked. "About a year ago," Deirdre said. "We were auditing the reserve fund accounts, and I asked for a breakdown of where the money had come from and where it was going. Sandra gave me a summary sheet. I asked for the detailed ledger and she told me it was not necessary for board members to have that level of detail, that it was handled by the treasurer." She paused. "She is the treasurer." I looked at her. "She is the president and the treasurer. She took over the treasurer role about 2 years ago when the previous treasurer moved out of the neighborhood. She said it made sense to consolidate the administrative functions temporarily." Temporarily. She said temporarily. It has now been 2 years. The coffee was hot and the kitchen was warm, and outside the wind was doing something nasty to the trees, and I was starting to understand that this was bigger than uneven snow removal, bigger than bogus fine rules, bigger than Sandra Fairbanks and her clipboard and her pom-pom hat. "The detailed financial records," I said. "Do you know what's in them?" Deirdre wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. "I have some suspicions. I do not have proof, but I pulled some of the vendor invoices for work done on the common areas over the past 2 years and cross-referenced them with what was in the reserve fund summary, and the numbers do not fully match up. There is a landscaping vendor that was paid $6,800 for common area work last summer. I have never seen that vendor's name on anything before. I called the landscaping company that I thought we had a contract with, and they told me they had not done any work in our community in 18 months. She said it very quietly, like she was still processing what it meant. I said, "I need to connect you with Patris Okafor." Patris, when I called her, came over within 20 minutes. She brought her legal pad. She sat across from Deirdre and asked careful, precise questions for 2 hours, and by the end of the evening we had a much clearer picture of what we were dealing with. Sandra Fairbanks appeared to have been routing fraudulent vendor payments from the HOA reserve fund to, at minimum, One company that had either done no work or dramatically less work than billed, and pocketing the difference. The unverified fine rules and the aggressive fine enforcement that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for 2 years appeared to be a mechanism for keeping the reserve fund full enough that the misappropriations would not show up as an obvious shortfall. The more fines she issued, the more money came in, the more she could skim off in fake vendor payments without the books looking obviously wrong. $250 per household on our block, times 22 households, was $5,500. From one inspection of one block on one snowy day, Patris looked at Deirdre. "You said the oversight investigator has already contacted you." "Yes." "You need to tell them everything you told us, not just about the fine rules, all of it. The vendor invoices, the reserve fund discrepancy, everything." Deirdre nodded. "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to do it without getting tangled up in it myself." "You came here tonight," Patris said simply. "That says something about your intent, but you need to cooperate fully and you need to do it now." Deirdre called the investigator the next morning. The following 10 days moved fast. The state's oversight office, upon receiving Deirdre's detailed account and the supporting documentation she had kept copies of, escalated the matter to the state attorney general's Consumer Protection Division, exactly as Patris had predicted they might. An AG investigator reached out to Patris and formally requested the camera footage I had from Sandra's inspection walk, the full correspondence record we had documented, and the governing documents analysis Patris had prepared. We handed everything over. Then, on a Thursday morning in late February, with 3 fresh inches of snow on the ground and the temperature at a deeply unpleasant 17 degrees, 2 vehicles pulled up in front of Sandra Fairbanks's house. One was an unmarked state police car. The other was a vehicle from the AG's office. 3 people went to her door. I happened to be home. A lot of us happened to be home, or to come home very quickly once Tom Nguyen sent a text to the block group chat that said simply, "You might want to look outside right now." I watched from my front window. I did not go outside to gawk, because that felt wrong, but I watched. Sandra came to the door in her robe. The conversation at the door was brief. She went back inside for several minutes, presumably to get dressed, and then she came out again in her coat, without her clipboard for once in her life, and got into the back of the state police vehicle. Gerald Fletcher was standing in his driveway watching. His hearing aid emitted a long, slow whistle of what I could only interpret as satisfaction. Sandra was not arrested that morning in the dramatic handcuff sense of the word. It was more of a "please come with us and answer some questions" situation, which is not the same thing as an arrest, but is a very serious thing. However, based on what Patris heard from the investigator over the following weeks, the questioning session was extensive. The financial records Sandra was required to produce were deeply problematic, and the picture that emerged from the investigation was not a good one for Sandra Fairbanks. The final accounting, once the AG's office had gone through everything, showed that Sandra had improperly fined homeowners in Maplewood Glen under unadopted rules totaling approximately $22,000 over 3 years, and had directed approximately $18,000 in fraudulent vendor payments from the reserve fund to a company that investigators linked to her brother-in-law, who operated a landscaping business out of a neighboring county and had, at best, done about $3,000 worth of actual work in the community for that payment. The remainder was a straightforward theft. Phil Greer, the other board member who had voted through everything Sandra presented, was not charged but was found to have been negligent in his oversight duties and was required to provide a sworn statement about the board proceedings. He resigned from the board within a week of being contacted by investigators, which was frankly the most decisive action Phil had ever taken in his tenure on that board. Sandra was formally charged with misappropriation of funds, which under our state statute for HOA financial crimes, given the aggregate amount and the nature of the scheme, qualified as a felony. She was charged in late March. Her arraignment was on a day that happened to be just a week before Tom Nguyen's small claims court date, which made the small claims matter somewhat moot, since the governing documents issue was now part of a larger proceeding. But Tom went to his hearing anyway and walked out with a judgment ordering the HOA to return his $200 wind chime fine plus his filing fee. He came straight home and put the wind chimes back up. They sounded wonderful. The practical matter of the neighborhood's fines took a bit longer to sort out. An emergency HOA membership meeting was called, the first actual full membership meeting Maplewood Glen had seen in 3 years, because Sandra had been finding ways to make those meetings technically compliant but practically inaccessible. And about 40 households showed up, which was more participation than the HOA had seen in a decade. Deirdre Calloway, given that she had cooperated with investigators and had no evidence of personal benefit from the scheme, agreed to serve as interim board president for the transition period. She was not anyone's ideal candidate, but she was the only one who knew where all the files were, and she was genuinely trying to fix things, so we worked with her. The membership voted, unanimously, to void all fines issued under the unadopted provisions Patris had identified. Every single one. Homeowners who had paid those fines were entitled to a refund from the reserve fund, which still had enough money in it to cover the refunds plus maintain basic operations, though it was considerably thinner than it should have been. A committee was formed to review and formally adopt or reject each of the provisions that had been operating informally. The committee included Patris, obviously, and Tom, and Renata Vasquez, who had paid $400 to refinance a fence, and 3 other homeowners. They went through every provision methodically, voted on what should actually be a rule and what should not, and submitted the properly formatted amendments to the full membership for a vote. The wind chime decibel rule did not survive committee. The shared accountability collective fine structure did not survive committee. The December 31st holiday decoration deadline was replaced with a January 31st deadline, which everyone agreed was actually reasonable. The fence color chart was simplified to not fluorescent and left at that. My porch railing chip notice was formally withdrawn, along with about 60 other pending violation notices that had been issued in the previous 3 months, because they were either based on unadopted provisions or had been issued in what the committee diplomatically described as a pattern inconsistent with equitable enforcement. My $250 fine for the shared accountability snow removal situation was voided along with everyone else's. So was the $150 correspondence harassment fine, which Patris noted in the official record had never had any legal basis whatsoever. Sandra Fairbanks pleaded guilty to the misappropriation charge in early summer. Her sentencing included a period of supervised probation, a substantial fine, and an order of restitution to the Maplewood Glen HOA for the misappropriated funds. She was permanently barred from serving in any fiduciary role in a homeowners association under state law, which is a specific penalty available under our state's HOA statutes for exactly this kind of thing. She moved out of Maplewood Glen before the summer was over. I do not know where she went, and I will be honest with you, I did not think about it very much. By the time spring actually arrived, genuinely arrived, with the snow finally gone and the ground thawing out and the first green things showing at the edges of lawns, Maplewood Glen felt different. I'm not sure I can explain it exactly, but it was the difference between a neighborhood that had been operating under a low-level dread for years and one that had shaken that off. People stood in their driveways and talked to each other. Tom's wind chimes were going in the breeze. Mrs. Abernathy had her front flower beds freshly planted. Gerald Fletcher's car was running fine with the new igniter in place. Patris was elected to the HOA board at the annual meeting, the first real contested election the HOA had held in years. 2 other genuinely qualified people ran alongside her, and all 3 of them won. The first thing the new board did was publish a plain language summary of the actual rules so that every homeowner could read them without needing to cross-reference 3 documents and a stack of amendments. The second thing they did was establish a clear process for any new rules or fine structures to be adopted, requiring proper member notification and vote. The third thing they did was hire an independent CPA to do an annual audit of the HOA finances, which would be published to all members. The fourth thing they did was send a letter to all Elmhurst Drive homeowners formally acknowledging the collective fine incident, the improper basis for those fines, and confirming their full voidance with an apology on behalf of the HOA. That letter, I will be honest, felt pretty good to get. Dave Kowalski, who had started all of this without doing a single thing wrong, bought himself a snowblower in November, one of those good heavy-duty ones that handles packed plow runoff without any trouble. He sent a message to the block group chat with a photo of it sitting in his garage, a big shiny red machine looking like the most triumphant piece of yard equipment in the history of suburban homeownership. The message just said, "Nobody's driveway is going to be uneven ever again." We all sent back laughing emojis. Mrs. Abernathy's reply, relayed through Terrence, was, "Tell them I want one too." I look back on it sometimes, particularly in those last cold weeks before spring when I was still scraping ice off my windshield every morning, and reminding myself that February always lies about being the last hard month. And what struck me was how a completely absurd thing, a fine for shared accountability over one neighbor's slightly uneven snow shoveling, had pulled an entire block of people together into something real and functional. We had not known each other that well before Sandra's letter arrived. We knew each other in the waving from driveways way, in the nodding at the mailbox way. We did not know that Patris was a paralegal with a remarkably sharp eye for procedural violations. We did not know that Gerald had been quietly fuming about HOA overreach for 2 years. We did not know that Renata had paid $400 over a fence color because she thought she had no choice. We know each other now. We know each other in the sitting around a kitchen table in a crisis way, in the banana bread during a war council way, in the helping push a car out of an icy driveway way. And Sandra Fairbanks, with her clipboard and her decibel meter and her made-up fine rules and her brother-in-law's landscaping invoices, had absolutely no idea that the thing she thought was her greatest leverage, the ability to isolate and intimidate individual homeowners one certified letter at a time, was exactly the thing that, when she overcorrected and sent that letter to our entire block at once, had collapsed the whole scheme around her. She had fined all of us for one driveway. She had just forgotten that fining all of us at once meant all of us would talk to each other. That was Sandra's real mistake. Not the fake rules, not the embezzlement, not the Pompum Hat inspection walk, though all of those were also mistakes. The mistake was the collective fine, the one that brought 25 people into my kitchen on a cold January Saturday with too many chairs and not enough table space, and a plate of Marcus Ackerfer's banana bread that disappeared in about 20 minutes. She thought she was fining a block. She actually organized a neighborhood. And I know this sounds like the kind of ending where everything wraps up a little too neatly, but I want you to know that the details are real. The certified letters are in a folder in my filing cabinet. The camera footage is on a drive in my brother-in-law's basement. Tom Small claims judgment is framed, a little bit ironically, on his living room wall next to a photograph of the bamboo wind chimes in question. And if you walk down Elmhurst Drive on a cold morning now, you will see driveways that are clearly and thoroughly shoveled, not because anyone is afraid of a fine, but because it turns out when people feel good about their neighborhood, they actually want to take care of it. Dave Kowalski's driveway, for the record, is immaculate, perfectly even curb to garage every single time. He has that snowblower to thank. And I suppose, in the most roundabout way possible, we have Sandra Fairbanks to thank too. Though I would rather not give her the satisfaction, so let's say we have the storm to thank. 14 inches of snow, 2 days of blowing and drifting, one section of refrozen plow runoff at the end of Dave's driveway, and one woman with a clipboard and a grudge and a scheme that had been quietly falling apart under its own weight for 3 years, just waiting for the right moment to come down. January will do that. It is cold and it is hard, and it strips everything back to what is actually real. And what turned out to be real on Elmhurst Drive, underneath all the certified letters and the fine notices and the Pompum Hat inspection walks, was a block full of people who, when it actually came down to it, knew how to take care of each other. That is the part Sandra never had a line item for. That is the part her clipboard could not measure.